Without further ado, I will turn it over to our CEO, Steve Houts.
Thank you, Laurel, and thanks. Good afternoon. Thanks, everybody, for being here in person. It's nice to see a number of faces in person that at least I, sometimes see on the video meetings, but to be here together in person is extra great. So thanks for making the effort to be here. Really appreciate it. As Laura mentioned, my name is Steve Houts. I'm proud to serve as president of MAC. MAC strives to be a place that promotes the opportunity for connections and relationships with colleagues across other organizations doing similar very, very important work, and we encourage the opportunity to kind of collaborate and lean on one another, especially during major challenge periods like we're going through now. So that's the broad context for today, and I hope you'll take some time to connect with some of your colleagues that maybe you don't see so often while you're here for that purpose. The overall context for today's session, we wanted to offer the opportunity for a forum and some discussion and learning to learn as much as possible together about the early stages and implications of the so-called One Big Beautiful Bill Act, OBBBA. We're hearing from members across the network that contingency and scenario planning and trying to react to changes in our externals are happening across the board in almost every one of our organizations. And so with that going on, it's important to have timely information and be up to speed on what's going on with some of the government external environmentals. Certainly at the federal level, more locally at the state level, Minnesota is already facing challenging budget deficit situation, and we think the recently enacted OBBBA bill will have broad ripple effects at the state and county levels for funding of the programs and services that you all provide. So really important, and we wanted to work together to begin to untangle the implications of all this together as we work to prepare for what's ahead and to continue to fight for our communities. Context for the speakers, more specifically, MAC has partnered for many years with Momentum Advocacy, formerly Hilden Law and Advocacy, as our policy and legislative advisory partner firm, working on challenges ranging over the years from COVID area emergency funding, helping us figure out how to respond to increasing administrative burden and compliance, kind of an anti-fraud narrative stemming from the Feeding Our Future scandal, among other similar kinds of things, fighting for reforms in state grant making, and sharing our network's experiences with the Trump administration's actions with our state level congressional leaders. So just Momentum Advocacy supports the network in a bunch of ways. And we're really grateful for the partnership in general. We're so glad to have them here today to help us understand what's going on with this bill and what the implications for Minnesota and all of us may be. Thrilled to have Amy Koch and Matt Burdick here. Thanks for being here. I'll let both introduce themselves more deeply. So for now, just hand it over to Amy and Matt. Thanks.
You have your choice of
Is this all right? All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Amy Koch, principal at Momentum Advocacy. I know quite a few of you in the room, and maybe not as much in person, but on Zoom, as we've also been doing end of session updates and sort of pre-session what to expect for a couple years now as well. I want to first of all thank you all for being here. And I think the crowd indicates what kind of a day it is for nonprofit providers in the state of Minnesota to see all of you here today, and we fully recognize that. I want to thank Tricia, Steve, Laurel for being really fantastic partners these last few years. But when we started, it was pre-COVID or right in the middle of 2020. And it was where Steve and Tricia came to me and said, we know for our members that we need to be involved at what's going on at the Capitol. And I could have never foreseen, from COVID to the fraud, waste, and abuse to the one big beautiful bill, where that journey could take us. But it has really been something. And I want to just point out, the folks at MAC have been fantastic. They show up at the Capitol. They're doing the meetings. Tricia was one of a few really sane voices testifying in front of committees this year and making big changes in some bills that had some really bad stuff based on specifically her testimony and those conversations that MAC was having. So I cannot emphasize enough the value and the good work that they've been doing. So thank you, Steve, Tricia, Laurel. Thank you all. Thank all of you. Momentum. Hilden Advocacy was the name. Nancy Hilden retired at the beginning of the year. So you've got myself and Brian McDaniel as the principals. And we have expanded the team. I want to just, back in the back, I've got a couple of our amazing team. Izzy Rojas, who's been with us now for 5 years, Izzy? Yeah, and Nick Sandberg, who joined the crew this year. So you'll be seeing them. I'm sure you've seen them in meetings. You'll see them in the future. Thanks for being here, team. And you know, the information we have to deliver today. Oh, I would also say just strangely enough, so Momentum has expanded into public affairs, communications. Since the split, we started doing federal lobbying, and this is interesting. We started it in August of last year, prior to the election, prior to anyone knowing. It's been something that we had wanted to get into. And again, it was kind of one of those things that if you'd have told me in August when I started federal lobbying that it was going to turn out to be, you know, this kind of a situation, I don't know that I could have believed it. But it was good timing, and it's an opportune moment that we can be there for you as members and for the association to deliver this information. And that brings me to this gentleman to my right, who's joined us as a strategic partner. You can ask anyone at the Capitol, anyone in the state of Minnesota that knows about HHS, who is the most knowledgeable person, and it's Matt Burdick right here. And I don't say that as hyperbole or favoritism. There's just no doubt about it. No one's better. Every legislator, everyone on the governor's staff, every association, every organization knows that this is the guy who knows everything about everything and can make things happen and can give you the information that you need. No one goes deeper and more in depth on issues than Matt Burdick. And also, he's got a tremendous heart for the mission. And to find those two things combined in a person, it makes him very much a unicorn indeed. And we're very grateful to be partnered with him and have a strategic alliance with Matt. So with that, thank you very much for being here today. And I'm going to put you in his very, very capable hands.
Thanks so much, Amy. Can everybody hear me okay? Well, that is quite the generous introduction, so hopefully I can live up to it. But I just really want to say thank you all for being here and taking an interest in this. What I'm hoping we can get out of today is a deeper dive than you may have seen reading the newspaper or whatever information is out there. And it's not with the intent of understanding all of the machinations of the Medicaid program, all the wonky details, but really what I'm hoping folks can take away are what are some of the key inflection points when it's going to be important to pay a little bit closer attention. And what are some of the opportunities that we have to influence at the state level what's been foisted upon us federally? We're also going to talk a little bit about some of the other kind of shoes that are going to drop. This, unfortunately, is not probably the last major transformation of our human services system that we're going to see coming out of DC, and probably not even the last we'll see this year, unfortunately. But I really think it's important for people to understand, because I think there's a lot of conversation happening about the bill, but the how and the when this will start to feel this in our communities is what I'm hoping you all can take away away from today. I love interactive conversations, so feel free to raise your hand, stop me along the way. If I use an acronym or getting too deep into, pull me up, ask questions. I want this to be really interactive. And if there's other things that you all have heard about related to this legislation, happy to have some conversation about that. And if I'm not familiar with it, happy to kind of do some digging and get back to you. Before I get into this, just a little bit about my background. I actually, as Amy said, I'm an advocate at heart. I started my career with the National Alliance on Mental Illness, doing statewide grassroots organizing and following their executive director around the Capitol, which is how I got introduced to this goofy world of public policy. From there, I spent about 10 years with the Department of Human Services. Before I left last summer, I was in charge of their government relations office. So I was in charge of the team that was the liaison between the department, the legislature, the governor's office, and other units of government. And what that essentially meant is that no one ever called me when the system was working. Everyone called me when it wasn't. So I got to play around and learn about all these different elements of the system. So I'm hoping to kind of use some of that knowledge about how do these things actually translate from policy into implementation to help kind of inform where we can also influence that conversation as a community. So without further ado, we'll get into it. All right. So I do want to, I'm on a campaign here. A funny thing happened process-wise where the actual title of this bill was actually taken off before it passed into law. And as I think we all can agree, one big, beautiful bill, regardless of your politics, when it comes to human services, is quite the misnomer. We are talking about extracting billions of dollars of resources from our human services system. So I like to call it HR1 or OBBBA for short, but it's not even the official name in law, so there is no reason we have to call this thing big or beautiful.
What is the name in law?
It's HR1. It's not anything fancy, but there's been a few of those over the years. So OBBBA is a nice shorthand. So just as I said, a little bit about what we're going to get into today. We're going to talk a little bit about the budget reconciliation process, just because I think that's important context for how we got here with such a major policy transformation that is also very, very unpopular. I think that machinations of how we got there is important context for this. We're going to spend the bulk of our time today talking about changes to Medicaid. And the reason for that is that's where most of the changes are, and that's what's driving most of the federal spending reductions in the bill. And that's also the area that I think is pretty wonky and difficult to message and talk about. So I think it's going to be helpful to have some deeper context about what's actually changing, because a lot of people are going to be trying to spin it the other direction to say, this is not actually doing any harm to the Medicaid program. So I think pulling back the hood a little bit will help people see where these cuts are really going to impact people's lives. But there's a lot that happens in this bill beyond Medicaid in the health and human services world, particularly around commercial health insurance that you buy off the health exchange, MNsure in Minnesota. Big changes to our food assistance program, SNAP, as well as some changes partially positive, but with some really unfortunate barnacles to the child tax credit that I want to make sure people are familiar with. So I think it will unfortunately not go as far as we want it to for the people that most need to access that. Want to talk about opportunities for advocacy, both in terms of the context of this bill, as well as other actions coming down the line. And then at the end, we're sharing some resources. I know Mac is also going to send out some resources for folks that really want to dive deeper, including some resources that you can use in advocacy and messaging as this continues. So just a quick primer on budget reconciliation. So budget reconciliation was the mechanism that this legislation passed. And essentially what this is a quick way to make adjustments to spending. So it's trying to make a difference between making major policy changes to the federal law, but making adjustments around the edges to taxes and spending. And why that's important is that through that process, the legislature can bypass the Senate filibuster. And so it has been used in many recent years. It's actually how the Affordable Care Act came into law to basically get around political gridlock to do pretty sweeping changes. What it also allows is sort of limitations on the process and ability for public input. Well, I think there was a lot of noise made in the media. There weren't traditional hearings and things in the same way that there are in other legislation in both bodies. And so it allowed for a lot of things just to happen in the dark of night, and we just sort of read about it after the bill was signed into law. I think that includes many of the people that voted for or against the bill, frankly. The saving grace of this is there are some parliamentary rules that the Senate imposes for the late Senator Byrd, called the Byrd Rule, that basically says there are some things that are really not appropriate for this process, and so they fall out of the bill. And we're going to talk about what some of those things are, because we expect those things to come back in various other forms, but at least there is some kind of guardrails placed on this process, because this bill frankly could have been worse. And as we talked about, it has changed its name. So just a little bit about the timeline. Congress worked on this throughout most of the spring, passed on July 3rd, signed into law on July 4th. If you were following along the way, this bill did not change as much as I think many of us anticipated between when it left the House and went to the Senate. There were a few pretty major things that we'll talk about, including some positive things, a $50 billion fund that we'll talk about what, if any, of that will reach Minnesota, but to really support rural health care, as well as some options to support people with disabilities that I think could actually be really transformational, but we'll talk about some caveats there. They tweaked around the edges on some of the other provisions, and then, like I said, they dropped some of the most harmful provisions, and we'll talk about what those are in more depth. So at a very high level, what does this bill do? And I'm just talking in the context of Health and Human Services. There's a lot of other things in the tax policy world that I won't get into. If anyone here is an Alaskan whaling boat captain, you made out pretty great. So congratulations to you. But that just sort of gives you a signal of some of the politics that were necessary to get this bill across the finish line. But at a high level, we're implementing work requirements or work reporting requirements for the first time in Medicaid. And I'm going to be very intentional about using that terminology, work reporting requirements, because this is not actually about ensuring someone has a job. This is about administrative processes that will likely result in many people losing their health care, and also cost states a lot of money that cannot be spent on actual health care delivery. Restricting Medicaid eligibility, access to those services, and even the benefits that people can receive. Most importantly, I think, for even folks that aren't directly working with the Medicaid program or aren't really interested in that space, this will result in a massive reduction in federal funding to the state, which will have to come from somewhere. And the state's budget is not in good shape, as we all know. It's going to be in worse shape as a result of this. And that's really why this is important for all of us to understand. On the private health insurance side, it's frankly just going to make it more expensive and harder for people to access private health insurance on the exchange. And so this is folks that can't get health insurance through their employer, small business owners, et cetera. This is going to be a real burden on a lot of folks, and it's going to shrink the universe of people that have health care. The cuts to the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program are kind of a double whammy. Similar to Medicaid, there's going to be restrictions on people and how they access the program, and then there's going to be a big shift in the funding obligation from the federal government to the state government. And so combined with the Medicaid cuts, once again, we're just sort of seeing the federal government's commitment to states to operate these shared programs really kind of dwindling under this legislation. And as I mentioned at the top, there is some increases to the child tax credit. I think that's probably the child tax credit has probably been one of the most impactful programs that we've seen in the last decade or so in terms of really making a difference in childhood poverty. But unfortunately, the way that they've structured these changes, it's going to leave the families that need this support the most behind and not really have a market benefit for them. And actually, for some families, it could mean losing some access to supports they have today. So we're going to get into the weeds on Medicaid, and I apologize. This is going to get a little bit wonky, but I'm going to try and keep it interesting and really focus on what you need to know. So I've kind of separated this into the various components of the Medicaid program, because I think it's important just to sort of understand how this is being attacked from all sides. So the first big change is how often certain people need to have their Medicaid redetermined. So in the Medicaid program, people are eligible based on different categories. So parents are eligible, people with disabilities are eligible, people who are over 65 are eligible, all with sort of different rules. And the Affordable Care Act newly expanded Medicaid to people who are adults and who don't have dependent children, but also don't have a certified disability. I think there's a lot of rhetoric about who this group of people are. And really, this is actually providing access to a lot of people who needed Medicaid for a long time, but either couldn't get through the disability determination, or people that have zero other access to health care that they could afford and use. And in Minnesota, actually, when this first passed, we saw a lot of people that had come in through the door of disability eligibility move over here because it was actually cheaper for the state and they didn't need all the more expensive services and they could keep more of their income. So there's a lot of folks that have disabilities that are part of this group of people. And so when we hear the conversation about this is just about quote unquote able-bodied adults, that's really a misnomer in terms of who these folks are. But the first big change, and a lot of the changes in this bill do target this group of people, was to change how frequently they need to have their eligibility redetermined. Right now, you apply for Medicaid once a year, and you typically get to keep it for that full year. Now, newly, for adults without children, starting in next year, or 2027, they will have to have their eligibility reviewed every 6 months. And that's no small process. And a lot of folks, especially if you're not stably housed, it's pretty easy to fall off just from some of these administrative burdens. So I think this is pretty well obviously intended to find more avenues to sort of remove people from coverage, and I think that's what we'll see. And that gets very expensive and very harmful for people because they often don't go back to redetermine until they need care. And we'll talk about some of the restrictions there in a moment. So as I said, in addition to having to renew your coverage every 6 months, everybody is going to actually reduce the window that they can have retroactive coverage. So one of the really cool features of the Medicaid program is you can get any services you received for the 3 months before you applied. Because most of us don't think about healthcare until we need healthcare, you often first have that conversation about how I'm going to pay for this when I show up at the emergency room. And maybe you had a few doctor's visits before then that led you to that, or you missed a few. The Medicaid program allows that period of time to be covered. This bill will shorten that beginning in January of 2027. So for the adults without children that we were just talking about, the expansion group, that's going to go down to just 1 month of retroactive coverage. And then for everybody else, it'll be 2 months. And so we're seeing, again, kind of that shrinking of the usability of the Medicaid program. There's a lot of changes against people who are not U.S. citizens. They amended the definition of a really awful term in federal law, qualified alien. Sorry that that's what they use. But what this did is essentially say if you have come to the U.S. based on various circumstances, we are not going to categorically deny you access to Medicaid and other benefits. And this bill greatly shrunk who gets that exception. And so some examples of who is now kind of excluded from this kind of better way of getting onto public healthcare programs, and they make these changes in other programs as we'll talk about: refugees, humanitarian parolees, people seeking asylum, people that have been victims of trafficking or domestic violence. Those were all categories that would allow you some pathway to get healthcare and other supports. That doorway is now closed. So for Medicaid, basically this means you can get emergency Medicaid, which essentially pays for care that you need to stay alive. In the hospital, very expensive. And it's a very limited kind of and difficult service to access. So essentially what this means for a lot of people in really vulnerable circumstances, their path to Medicaid coverage has essentially been closed unless they can find another pathway to citizenship. There was a few things that happened during the tail end of the last administration that were really positive. As people may remember, during COVID, we kept everybody on Medicaid because we were in the midst of a once-in-a-lifetime public health crisis, and it seemed right that people would have health insurance when we're in the middle of a pandemic. So the federal government, actually it was under the Trump administration that this was first enacted, just kept everybody on Medicaid. But as the pandemic waned and people returned back to more usual order of life, states actually had to go and review every single person on Medicaid all at once. And that went about as well as you can imagine. I'm sure many of you were involved in helping people navigate through that process. Minnesota actually did, to our credit, did better than a lot of places. But it was a mess, and it really exposed some of the wonkiness and some of the inefficiencies in our eligibility process. So they enacted an administrative rule to really make some better changes. Things like not necessarily requiring someone to have all their applications in for every other benefit while they're applying for care, or really requiring states to put in timelines for how quickly they process applications. This bill delays the enforcement and the implementation of that rule. The good news is in a previous version, they were just going to repeal it outright, which would have actually led to chaos. Many states, including Minnesota, have started to implement many of these things. And so they would have had to somehow kind of go back to the old order, would have been extremely costly. But what this will mean is states aren't going to get any federal support to make these changes. And Minnesota probably has one of the worst Medicaid IT systems in the nation. I'm not speaking out of school. The Department of Human Services would say this and has said this. And so if we have to make changes, we need federal support. And so oftentimes we need that federal mandate to goad the legislature into funding it. So while this won't necessarily create new challenges to eligibility, it will defer progress on making that system more functional for people amidst all these other changes that we're doing at the same time. There are some changes in the bill that are frankly common sense, and I think many would welcome, including many states. There's some provisions around requiring states to just update people's addresses more frequently and actually leverage managed care companies, which do a lot of the work in Medicaid to help people keep addresses current. That's a big barrier for people who are trying to keep their coverage current because states often don't know where they live. So I see this as actually a positive. And then there's some enhanced requirements that states check various databases to make sure that you don't have individuals or providers who have died on your Medicaid rolls. That's a pretty common sense piece. I don't think it'll have any disruption on folks. And actually, hopefully, especially on some of these other provisions, the feds can actually support states to make sure that they're keeping these lines clean. We're going to spend quite a bit of time talking about Medicaid work reporting requirements because I think this is probably the most harmful and impactful part of this legislation with regard to the Medicaid program. So just as an overview, as of December 31st, 2026, so really 2027, states must implement work reporting requirements for people who are in that expansion population that I mentioned. And how do you meet these requirements? You can do it in a few ways. One is that you show that you are working, you're completing community engagement activities, which could mean going to school, being in a job program, or some combination of that for at least 80 hours in a month. Alternatively, if you can demonstrate that you've got taxable income that's equal to 80 times the federal minimum wage, you can also become exempt. And then there are thankfully some provisions that were put in at the 11th hour to really recognize seasonal work, farm work, et cetera, where you might not be having steady work throughout the year and making sure there's some ability to navigate through that. If you fail to show that you are meeting these, if you're applying for Medicaid, you will be denied. And if you're on Medicaid at the time of your eligibility renewal, which again will now happen every 6 months, then you are disenrolled and have to come back through having proved that you meet these requirements anew. And the way they're going to look at this is basically in the month before you apply. So if I'm trying to get healthcare in September, I need to have shown that in August I have done all these things. And so it's going to create kind of a catch-22 for people that are probably seeking Medicaid because they need Medicaid and need healthcare services to basically show that they're doing a lot in order to access that. One of the other things that I think is particularly pernicious about this is if you get kicked off of Medicaid because of this, you can't access tax credits to buy insurance through the health exchange if that was even a possibility. And so really what they're saying is if you fail this test, you don't get access to publicly supported healthcare, period. Another part that makes this really tricky is there's often flexibility that states can leverage to make changes to the Medicaid program via what are called 1115 or demonstration waivers. The law explicitly says that cannot be used to waive these requirements. And what that means is that even if there's a change at the president, this will require an act of Congress to undo. And so this is going to be around for a while is my prediction, and it's going to be about softening the blow and hopefully delaying it. I also just say January of 2027 sounds like it's right around the corner. When we're talking about an IT and an infrastructure overhaul of a system, it's basically yesterday. I don't know how any state in the nation is going to meet this deadline. As I mentioned, the verification period is at least the month preceding and then ongoing for at least 1 month while you're eligible. But states can put more frequent verifications in. I don't anticipate the state in its current political makeup will do that, but I think understanding that there are flexibilities for states to actually make these even harder for people is important. So the decisions made at the state level about how these are implemented will really matter. There are requirements for states to streamline and really try to minimize the burden on the individual and rely on existing data systems to verify this. We don't have a great track record of this, and so I'm skeptical about how useful this will be. Interestingly, they have basically said managed care organizations can't have an active role in helping states meet this. And that's unfortunate because I said most people on Medicaid are in a managed care organization. That's an organization that would be familiar with them, have an easier path to contact them. Oftentimes people don't know they're on Medicaid. My card doesn't say Medicaid, it says Blue Plus. And so breaking that linkage, I think, is intentionally designed to make it more difficult. Thankfully, there are due process and appeal rights, but I think, as we all know, those systems are incredibly difficult to navigate. It requires someone even having the knowledge that they exist and usually having support to navigate them. And I would expect, just given the volume of people this will impact, those processes are going to be delayed quite a bit. And so it's going to make a real challenge for both people and for the state and the county and tribes who are doing the on-the-ground processing work. As I said, the compliance date is January of 27. The feds are required to issue rules for states by June of next year. So really, states are going to get the blueprint for how this is going to work, and they're going to have 6 months to put it into action. I don't know how that's possible. CMS has committed to trying to get these rules out sooner. And these rules are those first of those things I was talking about that'll be really important to pay attention to. The law was very prescriptive. It gave us a lot that we know about this, but the devil is going to be in the details of these rules. That's going to outline really what flexibility, if any, states have. And so once those come out, that will be a really important advocacy standpoint to really understand that, of what tools does the state have available to it, what are they required to do, and what are they doing out of convenience. I think it's going to be on the community collectively to push the state to really minimize the burden on people for this. Another really key piece is there is an ability for CMS to give states more time. Just 2 years, but that would be welcome reprieve. CMS is signaling that states should not be expecting these, that they will be the exception, not the rule. And frankly, what we have seen is that this administration is looking at who runs a state and whether they are politically aligned in making these decisions. I would be shocked if Minnesota got an extension on this deadline. The other big thing to look out for is states are required, starting in October of next year, to start telling enrollees that this is coming. So really, they have to have everything figured out prior to that, or as much as possible. And I'm really hoping that it'll be on all of us sort of next spring, next summer, to really work with the state to make sure that messaging is effective and not scary. This is a really scary set of changes, but we also don't exactly know how it's going to work. And so I think it's really unfair to tell someone you're going to lose your benefits without really understanding what could you do to prevent that. And so that October notice timeline is going to be really key, and what those messages look like and making sure they're actually meaningful to people is going to be really a key point of advocacy. There are some grants that the legislation set out to help states implement this. How or what or when Minnesota will get any of that money, very much up in the air. But that's, again, another place that we could potentially have opportunities for advocacy about how are you partnering with community organizations to help spread the word on this and to do some of that outreach. That's one example of how that money could possibly be spent. Thankfully, there's a lot of exceptions to these requirements. I think that's a double-edged sword because it's super complicated. Oh, thank you. It's super complicated, but it does mean that there are better paths for people to be able to get out from under this regime. So that includes people who are pregnant, as well as that you get automatic coverage for 12 months postpartum. And so that will at least exempt some universe of folks, foster youth and former foster youth. I think some of the ones that are really interesting, this idea of medically frail. It's undefined, and there will be some wiggle room for the feds and the state to define this. I think one of the things that states are really going to push for is to have a very broad view of especially behavioral health conditions that make these requirements inappropriate for a person. And so how we kind of effectuate these in Minnesota are going to be really key. But again, we don't really know all the details of this until those rules are set out. But I would say, if you spend any time with any part of this, these mandatory exceptions are a really good place to do some thinking about how can we define these in a way that's advantageous for people. There's also some optional hardship waivers, which is, again, another opportunity for advocacy. Ask the state to take these up. That includes if you're in inpatient care, including behavioral health care or a nursing home, natural disasters, and then high unemployment. So there's a lot here that we can do to try and make this a little bit more functional. But again, with each thing we add, it does add a little bit more complexity and puts burden on the folks having to do that work. Shifting gears on limiting access to healthcare and services. So as you can see, a theme developing here, there is really a lot of effort to make life difficult for people in that adult expansion group. And another way they are doing is requiring cost sharing. As folks may know, in Minnesota for many, many years, we had cost sharing in the Medicaid program. It's between $1 and $3. And if you didn't pay, you still got the service. So it basically amounted to a $1 or $3 payment cut to providers for the most part. And so Minnesota chose in 2023 to do away with that because it wasn't bringing in any revenue to the state to speak of, and it was just making life really difficult for providers and sometimes scary for people because people didn't often know they had the right to receive care if they couldn't afford the copay. And so I'm sure there are people that didn't get care because they had that fear. So this is now requiring states to impose that, but do so in a really, really weird way. So it only applies to that expansion group and only with people whose incomes are over 100% of the federal poverty guidelines. And the expansion group goes from 0 to 138. So somehow we're going to have to identify who's between 100 and 138. And then we're going to have to say, what service are you getting? And then what dollar figure are we going to apply such that it can't be more than $35 and we can't charge you more than 5% of your overall income. If someone can figure out that math problem, you have a wonderful career ahead of you in actuary science, because that is a puzzle that just makes my head hurt. But I think it just sort of demonstrates this is not really policy rationale. It's just trying to make people's lives difficult. And again, there's so many exclusions: primary care, emergency room care, a lot of behavioral health care. So it's very hard to see how this will impact people. I think, unfortunately, the state will spend a lot of money for something that doesn't really do much, and it's just sort of a pain in everyone's neck again. One other piece I should mention on that is there's now an option for states to say if a person can't pay, you can deny them care. I don't see Minnesota taking up that option, but again, that's just one of those things that's going to be, this bill I feel like is a time bomb. There's a lot of things lurking out there that might come and hit us 15 years down the line, depending on what situation is at the state level as well. Another really big provision that I'm sure folks have heard about is this 1-year ban on Medicaid funding for certain family planning providers. It's no secret that this is intended to essentially wipe out Planned Parenthood, which is a really, as I think folks know, really important kind of cornerstone of the healthcare continuum, does a lot of work, especially in greater Minnesota, cancer screening, so much more beyond what they are known for. This, as last I checked this morning, is actually under federal injunction, is not taking effect. I think the next arguments are in September. So we'll see where this goes. But if this went into effect, essentially most Planned Parenthood programs in this country and a lot of their affiliate programs would be unable to access any federal Medicaid funding, which would put a large, large swath of them out of business pretty much overnight. And so this, if this does take effect, will pretty much reshape the landscape of healthcare. And I think largely in rural areas, frankly, where it's going to be the most impactful. But we'll see how that plays out. So now getting into where are they coming for the state's money? And again, as I said at the top, this, you don't need to understand the hows or the whys or the wonky details of this, but I think it's just really important for us all to be aware that the state's budget's likely to have a very big hole in it. And we'll talk a little bit about the timing of that too, because it's not going to necessarily be come November. But before we get into the weeds, I just want to kind of orient people to a couple of things that I think are important, because this is where the bulk of the savings comes. So for many, many years, states have used a couple of really interesting policy levers to basically make up for the fact that the Medicaid program has never really been properly funded or designed to be sustainable. And those two levers are provider taxes and what are known as directed payments. So provider taxes are kind of like what they said. You put a tax on a healthcare service, but why it's interesting is when you put a tax on a Medicaid service, and then you can build that into the Medicaid rate and get a federal match on that dollar. So while the state is taxing $1, it gets $1 back. And so that's a way for states to expand the ability of the amount of funding they have to pay for healthcare. Minnesota Care is essentially, for many, many years, funded by a healthcare provider tax. And we've done additional ones over the years to really help sustain our healthcare system. Directed payments are a more recent development, but basically just says you tell managed care organizations what to pay. And so sometimes that's paired with a provider tax to get more money and then pay more than you otherwise would. And that's largely used for hospitals. And we actually passed some legislation in Minnesota this past year that we'll talk a little bit about that is now directly impacted by this. But just a little bit of a primer on those kind of wonky concepts. So what does this bill do and why does it matter? First of all, it bans states from enacting any new provider taxes, increasing existing provider taxes, or expanding them to new groups. So as we talked about, the state's about to lose a lot of Medicaid money. provider tax would have been a natural place to look. We do no longer have that option on the table. So I believe our provider tax is currently 1.8% on the overall one, and we've got some other ones in there. Those are essentially frozen in time. And until this legislation were to be changed, we can do nothing new in the provider tax space. That is a tool that we have lost from our toolbox. It also limits how states design their tax programs. There's a lot of weedy, complicated stuff regarding this I won't get into, but it could mean Minnesota actually having to lower some of our existing provider taxes or eliminate them altogether. And so not only can we not use new ones, we might actually lose some of the existing ones we have. And then it caps those directed payments at the Medicare rate. And so the bill that passed this last session would have used that arrangement to actually pay hospitals at the average commercial rate. So private health insurance, as folks probably know, pay way, way better than either Medicare or Medicaid. And it was sort of seen as a lifeline to our hospitals, which many of which are really under financial strain. Whether or not that will be able to be implemented from the outset remains to be seen, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But over time, that will ratchet down to Medicare and may make that just really not worthwhile to our hospitals and will result in, I'm sure, some hospitals closing. They are also making reductions to the federal matching funds. There was a lot more serious provisions in this that we'll talk about, but the one that they did do is they made changes to that emergency Medicaid program I talked about before. So this is for people that cannot get on Medicaid because of their citizenship status and pays for basically end of life or life-saving care that you need to survive. Previously, if you were in that adult expansion group and you got this service, the federal government picked up 90% of that tab. That will now go down to 50%. It's not a lot of people, but you can imagine what kind of services we're talking about. Dialysis, cancer treatment. These are very expensive healthcare services. This will not result in less people being able to access them, thankfully, but it will be another hit to the state's budget. This is probably the wonkiest one that they did, but I think it's important to understand. They've adjusted how the federal government audits states. So just like any big enterprise, states undergo audits to make sure that they are paying for healthcare services for people that are eligible and for services that were properly provided. They do this on a regular basis, and generally there's about a 3% error rate, which is pretty typical for an audit. You get some window of error because that's natural. There's always going to be some error that is forgivable. But the feds had the ability to waive any penalties for errors above that if it was clear. This is really about documentation. You didn't pay for anything or anyone that wasn't qualified to get it. You just didn't write it down in the right place. Things like that. This essentially says 3% is now the hard cap. And there's very few circumstances in which if you go above that, that's forgivable. So that means the feds will penalize states when they're above that cap. They've also said they could choose to look at other federal audits other than the standard one that they do every year. They could also look at state audits. And I don't know what they mean by state audits, but we have a very active legislative auditor. So if you could imagine every time they went out and looked at the Medicaid program, we'd blow past that 3% pretty quickly. So once again, it's just another ability to extract money from the states, not necessarily based on anything the states have been doing wrong or anyone that's been creating issues for the program. It's really just a way for a lot of federal money to leave Minnesota. And unfortunately, the way this will work is very unpredictable. We'll spend the resources, we'll do the work, and then 2 years later we might get audited and have a big take back that could swing our state's budget pretty radically. Thankfully, this doesn't take effect until October of 2029, so there is time to stave this one off, but we'll see where it goes. So I do want to talk about some positives. This is not all negative in this bill. So there is, in response to a lot of those changes that are going to impact hospitals, particularly rural hospitals, there was a $50 billion, what they're calling Rural Health Transformation Program. It'll be distributed over about 5 years, and 50% of it will go across states equally who have an approved plan. And then the remainder will be split among some portion of the states, but there's a lot of discretion there. But I do think Minnesota will see some of this funding. What is so troubling about this is states have to submit their plan no later than the end of this year. As of this morning, we are hearing the application may be out sometime in September, maybe October. So states are going to maybe have 4 to 6 weeks to design an application to ask for whatever their share of this $50 billion is. If anyone's ever worked in or around state government, you know how amazingly efficient of an institution that is. Never any delays, everything goes super smoothly. So how this will roll out, it remains to be seen. And there's frankly a lot of discretion on the back end if CMS doesn't like how a state is spending the money to take it back, to move it between grantees. So how much of this actually hits Minnesota will remain to be seen. And I think, Amy, to your federal lobbying, some of our rural congressional members need to be put on notice that Minnesota would like its share of this money. And this is just a little bit about what it can be used for. It's very broad-based. This has been talked about as a hospital relief fund in the media, but how the feds are talking about it as really about transformation and innovation. They are not interested in just making up for the losses that this bill created. So I think while this is being messaged as sort of, oh, don't worry, we're giving you money through this other channel, that's not really what's happening here. I think this could do a lot of good, but don't let anyone tell you that this money is somehow mitigating the direct impacts of this bill. It's not what it's there for, and it's not what it will do. And it's also temporary. The other new really positive thing is a new option for disability waivers. Disability waivers are a creative mechanism in the Medicaid program to pay for care for people with disabilities in the community versus having to be in an institution. What's exciting about this new opportunity, which doesn't come until July of 2028, is it removes that institutional level of care requirement to access these types of services. So think about people with really intractable behavioral health conditions, but maybe don't qualify to be in long-term nursing home care. This could be really exciting and expansive of our service continuum in Minnesota. I say could be because we need to put up the state match to get these federal dollars. And I don't know where that state match is coming from, given everything else I just talked about. But I do have hope that this could be something that's really powerful down the line when we are in a better situation. I'm going to talk a little bit about what was not finalized, because as I said, I expect each and every one of these to show back up somewhere sometime soon. Right now, when someone's on Medicaid, and states have a little bit of time to basically verify if their citizenship status. That can be a pretty cumbersome process, as anyone that's worked in the immigration world knows. And what this would have done is say, during that period while you're verifying someone, there's no federal matching dollars available. So states, you could cover, but you have to foot the whole bill. So our state's really going to do that. That thankfully was not included, but I could see it coming back. I think this next one would have been really, really devastating for Minnesota, would have basically reduced the federal matching funds for any state that provides healthcare for people who are not U.S. citizens or have legal immigration status from 90% to 80%. And Minnesota does this. We made changes to that program this last session that limits it to children that would not have protected Minnesota. We would have just basically taken a funding cut for how we spend our own state's resources. So thankfully that was removed from the final bill. There were some other kind of little wonky things around pharmacy that I won't get into. And then actually something that I think will show back up in an administrative rule was a ban on federal funding for gender affirming care. And we have already seen some talk about a new federal rule coming to try and do this. What the specifics of that are remain to be seen. So once again, what is dead is not necessarily dead for long. So those ideas are going to come back. So it's important to understand. The House actually took a few provisions out that weren't removed for process reasons, for reasons unknown. One is a big cut that's set to take effect to hospitals that serve a disproportionate amount of Medicaid. This is set to take effect in October. I hold faint hope that Congress will still act on this before we get to the deadline of October, but it's sort of a looming threat here. And then some other changes that are not as impactful. The one that I think would have been really helpful, allowing, making it easier for providers out of state to enroll in different states' Medicaid programs. This is very common when kids, especially with mental health conditions, need residential care in a different state, making it easier for those providers to get access so that we can improve that access. But hopefully that will show up in a positive way somewhere in the future. So let's talk a little bit about beyond Medicaid. The private health insurance market. Now, the bill itself included a whole sweeping slew of changes, that many of which didn't make it to the final legislation, but have since been enacted by administrative rule. So again, just because we can defeat it on one front, they're back at it with the other one. What I think the most important thing to understand is during COVID, the feds pumped a lot of extra money into support to make this healthcare affordable. And that drove the historic increase in people accessing healthcare through this mechanism. Those are set to expire at the end of this fiscal year. That is another thing that I have faint hope that Congress might act upon, because it will basically decimate people's ability to pay for this. And it also impacts funding to Minnesota Care through a very wonky formula that I won't get into. It also limits the ability to apply outside of the open enrollment period, so if people's circumstances change and they find themselves in need of healthcare, that the opportunities to get that healthcare are diminished. Right now, a lot of people, if they're on the exchange, click a button and get their healthcare renewed for the next year. They've put in a whole slew of processes to make that pretty much impossible. So you kind of have to go through the whole rigmarole every year to get your healthcare and your tax credits. It's about making it really hard to use the system. And then that same limitation on people that don't have citizenship, including refugees, DACA recipients, et cetera, that applies to the individual market too. So not only can you not get Medicaid, you also can't get private healthcare. And sneak preview, you also can't get SNAP, because they wrote this into the law in pretty much everywhere they could find. The changes to SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, are probably also among the most devastating in the bill and somewhat akin to what the Medicaid cuts are. For one, it expands the work reporting requirements that have long been in place by raising the age bound from 54 to 64, and then removing certain exceptions, including for veterans, people experiencing homelessness, youth aging out of foster care. Pretty much everyone is going to be subject to these now. It also limits states' ability to waive those requirements where feasible. And those changes are in effect right now. They basically took effect with the bill. It also restricts how states treat things like energy assistance payments, basically saying you shouldn't have to pick between your light bill and putting food on your table. Again, this is just going to result in people's SNAP benefits being reduced. And then I think two changes I really want to highlight here, again, are a shift in the funding from the feds to the states. So this is going to force states to pay for a portion of the benefits, which is brand new. Typically, the benefit side of SNAP has been 100% federally funded. So depending on what their error rate is, and in Minnesota, we use our county partners to do SNAP eligibility, and they're going to have their hands full with Medicaid work reporting requirements, these new work reporting requirements, everything else in this bill. And so how well they do at that will dictate how much of this program Minnesota pays for. And that could be between 5 and 15%, which will add up to tens of millions of dollars that Minnesota is paying for this program. It also reduces what they pay for the admin side of this program from 50% to 25%. That's just a direct cut to Minnesota's budget. Thankfully, those latter two take effect a little bit further out. And you'll notice a lot of these effective dates are 2026, 2027. I think that's very intentional. I think Congress did not want the effects of this bill to be felt prior to the midterm elections. And so where I think we'll start to see these really hit us is in that November forecast released shortly after the 2026 election and teeing up for the 2027 legislative budget session. That's where I think the real action is. As I mentioned, a change to the child tax credit, which is welcome. Like, this has been such an effective program, we should be building on it. So they raised the benefit amount from $2,000 to $2,200. It was $2,500 in the House, but it doesn't change the underlying structure of the tax. And so basically, if you're a two-parent family with two kids, you need at least $48,000 to get the full credit, to see more credit. So the irony of the way they structured this is they increased it, but the people that would really use it the most aren't going to benefit from this increase. And so it's a really troubling way that they did this. It also adds a requirement that the parent have a Social Security number. And so this is leaving out a lot of families who are here paying taxes, but because the parent may not have a Social Security number due to their immigration status, the entire family loses out on this. So that was a lot of really awful information. I apologize. I just am the bearer of bad news, but let's talk about what we can do about all this. But first, I want to share a little bit more bad news. There's more on the horizon. There's a couple of things I want people to be keeping an eye on. So you may have been following recently what was called this rescission process, whereby the president says to Congress, I know you passed all these things, but I don't want to spend that money. Would you take the money back? And they were successful in very recent days. That was not in the human services realm. It was focused on foreign aid and public media. But there is a pretty active talk about a new set of rescission, and including some ones using some really weird parliamentary tricks that they could do without even the Congress acting. So keeping an eye on this rescission process, if you see that word anywhere, be looking out for any programs that you rely on in your work, because this is a very pernicious threat to our whole system. And we are weeks away from the end of the budget. The federal budget operates on a September to October budget cycle. And so technically, Congress needs to enact a new federal budget by October 1st. They are currently on break. They come back right after Labor Day. That gives them less than 30 days to enact a new federal budget. I don't think there is a universe in which that happens. So then we're talking about short-term budget deals called continuing resolutions, other tactics, or alternatively, a government shutdown. And I think the risk of a federal government shutdown during this cycle is very high. But regardless, what happens as part of that budget setting process is also really key to pay attention to. Thankfully, they will need the 60 votes for that process, but I still fear for what comes out of that process. And as you've heard me allude to several times, regulation is also a key place to keep an eye on. Everything that can't happen through the Congress, I expect to happen through administrative rulemaking. And why that's important is there's opportunities for people to make public comments when those administrative rules come out, which can then be useful in ongoing legal disputes of those rules. Thankfully, rules are easier to change between administrations and via other actions, but they still do have the force and effect of law, and so they are really important to pay attention to because they will have direct impacts. Executive orders are a little bit funky because they don't really have any teeth to them, but they do set a big stage. And so I'm going to talk about in a future slide here some of the recent ones that have happened, because I think they set a tone for what we might see in more formal actions. So at the very beginning of this administration, there was an executive order focused on grant-making priorities. And it basically said every grant should be philosophically aligned with the president's priorities. And what we saw 2 months after that was a full-scale stop on thousands and thousands and thousands of federal grants. I'm sure many in this room were impacted by that, and it was maddeningly disruptive. Well, just last week, there was a new executive order that sort of doubled down on this. So I think we need to be looking closely at our federal grant exposure and what might be future at risk. There was a reinterpretation of a long-standing policy and precedent about who can access services through things like Head Start, which I know many in this room are focused on federally qualified health centers and others. And they basically narrowed the universe of who could access these services based on immigration status and sort of put a threat over the head of some of these organizations about, can I be serving people in my community without risking federal funding? That's being litigated, thankfully, and is currently stayed by the courts. But it's an action of how a policy memo from a bureaucratic agency in DC could essentially wipe a funding stream out for entire sectors of our continuum. So I mentioned before those administrative rules on the private market healthcare. It's already in effect, and we're expecting one on gender affirming care any day now. And then there was this recent one focused on homelessness and mental health issues. I fully expect that to be kind of trickle down in the coming months to grant-making priorities, really saying harm reduction is no longer an allowable grant use under federal funding. And so those executive orders are really key to get sort of like, where are they going next, even if it doesn't directly hurt us today. So I've been saying this to everyone, and it's a distressing thing to share, but I think for any organization, taking a hard look at every federal funding stream you have right now and figuring out if this were to be paused, be revoked, be shifted tomorrow, what would I do? I never thought we'd be in a situation where federal funding was an unstable revenue source. That used to be the one that you could put as your reserve, basically. I think it's probably one of the riskiest ones we have these days. And so really taking a careful eye to that. And then in the context of state funding, I think it's going to be really key for everyone to say what is essential, because a lot of programs are going to see funding reductions and or elimination as the realities of this hits. Probably, like I said, in the 2027 budget cycle is when we're going to start feeling that. So now is the time to really be shoring up and making our case about why these state programs are important, and even be thinking about which ones, if we had to make a choice, would we let go of or see shrink a little bit. It's unfortunately that kind of reality. And hopefully the state also musters the ability to raise some revenue and do some things, but I think the risk of federal or state cuts is high, if not certain. So what can we do at each level? So in the federal level, I think it's important to really be educating members of Congress. I don't think members of Congress have read this bill. And that's not uncommon. It's pretty common for most every piece of legislation. But there's a war of narratives out here right now. And I think really helping Congress understand the practical impacts on the ground here in our state is going to be important. And the reason for that is Congress often does these big splashy bills, and then what they don't do in a big splashy way is delay, repeal, modify. That funding cut to hospitals that I mentioned that hasn't gotten delayed yet, I think that got implemented 10 years ago, or enacted 10 years ago, and they just kick the can down the road every couple of years. I expect many of the provisions in this bill could befall a similar fate if there's enough pressure on Congress to do so. Make those comments on all the federal rules and other actions that are happening. It's exhausting and it gets old, but it does help build that longer term legal and frankly policy and political case against these things. And then, like I said, just really look at what are those funding opportunities that are coming to states, and how do we want to shape how the state spends that federal money? And then keep an eye on those things that didn't get enacted and start making the case against them now. And then at the state level, like I said throughout this presentation, there's a lot of policy choices the state will have on that cost sharing provision. It says between $0 and $35. We haven't seen the final rules on it, but to my mind, 1 cent is between $0 and $35, and that could make life easy for everybody. How do you verify those work reporting requirements? How do we push the state to say, we're going to tap into the unemployment system, we're going to tap into other resources? We know a lot about people, and we have better technology than we've ever had before to make sure people aren't having to jump through hoops because we have state systems that don't talk to each other. And then how can we push the state to really take up every flexibility and option to make this as easy as possible? And then those state budget decisions, that's going to be the real fight. And we don't know where that goes until we see the state's budget forecast. But even in this coming session, I could see the beginnings to start implementing some of these pieces because the state needs time to do their work. This is unhelpful for this presentation, but when you get these slides, I encourage you to go look at all of these resources. KFF does an amazing job of putting all of this in a really nice, neat package. The Minnesota Budget Project has been doing a lot of really great work, including a lot of messaging toolkits to help share the word about what's happening here. And then I think our state agencies have done a nice job of also providing some resources that can really be helpful in telling the story that people can understand it. For those that really like to get into the weeds, I included a number of implementation tracker links, and these are just nice resources that have kind of timelines so you can kind of see when all of these various things are going to happen. I'm a visual person, so for me it's really helpful to see this on a calendar that I have literally pasted on my wall so I can think about, oh, we're getting to October 2026. I need to be thinking about those work reporting requirement notices that are going to come out, and people are going to start hearing about this. So I want to make sure that I know what to tell people when they come asking what's changing for my coverage. So I really encourage you to take a look at these and spend some time with them. And with that, just thank you. I know that was a lot, both emotionally and content-wise, but I just really appreciate all for your time and attention today, and welcome questions or conversation that you want to have.
And I have the mic here.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, it's a lot. So appreciate you bringing your expertise, help us all understand this. I do have a question, and I guess I'd like for you to try to put your feet in the shoes of a legislator in this upcoming session, and or some of the key policymakers, commissioners. What are they going to be working on, thinking about as we sort of march toward these deadlines and our budget? So just kind of give us a sense of where you think their heads are at and what we could be expecting this session as far as planning work and conversations and budget implications.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. I think my prediction for this session, which is not uncommon for the second year of the legislative cycle when we have a set state budget, I don't anticipate that the impacts of this to be felt in this current budget cycle. So I don't anticipate the state will actually have to pass literally anything to get out of session. And I predict something along those lines is what's going to come. This is what I like to call a teeth gnashing session, where everyone kind of yells at each other and they talk a lot about all the big things that are going to happen, but not a lot gets done. That said, some of these deadlines are coming up quick. So I think about the work reporting requirements. If DHS has any hope of getting that implemented, they're going to need some funding and some law changes to start this session. So I believe we'll start to see the start of the conversation. I'm just pessimistic, both by the makeup of the legislature right now, the deaths of the Speaker Hortman. There's so much that is working against collaborative and collegial progress in the legislature during this session, including an upcoming election of the entire legislature and the governor, that I worry that not a lot gets done and that it kicks the can down to a very short timeline in 27.
We welcome questions. We also welcome if anyone wants to share their story about how they're preparing and scenario planning and all of that good stuff.
Thank you for the presentation and the information. I have a question. It's a little bit in the weeds, but you seem like a person who would be good for an in the weeds question.
You're speaking my language, yes.
Do you know about Medicaid waiver programs that are state administered? If there's any potential impacts on those? The one I'm thinking of in particular is the Minnesota Family Planning Program.
Yeah, at this time, nothing in the legislation directly imperils those. So that's a positive. But I would say everything is on the table. When I first came to Medicaid, it was really shocking to me how much of the Medicaid program is actually optional. Like not so fun fact, actually awful fact, pharmacy is an optional benefit. So prescription drugs is an optional benefit that states can choose not to cover in their Medicaid program. And some states probably might because it's really expensive. There's a lot of parts of the Medicaid program that are not foundational and are not required. And so I think really digging into kind of all of that is important. I don't expect something like the family planning program to be on the chopping block in the immediate, but really especially like the really creative, the innovative parts of our Medicaid program, I fear those are the first to go because we're literally making a choice between drug coverage and innovation.
And are most of those determinations made solely at the state level?
Yep. So the feds mandate very little in terms of what states must do and then give states a lot of flexibility. Ironically, they've added quite a few more mandates through this legislation, but none of them are like, do these good things.
All right, other comments, questions, thoughts? What's coming to
One up front
mind?
here.
There's a hand.
Regarding the work requirements, I'm thinking for SNAP, we've read that they could potentially be fulfilled with volunteering. Is that true? And
Yeah.
if so, what does it look like?
That's a great question, and that's one of those things that's going to be in those rules. I think, and I'm less familiar with the SNAP program than I am Medicaid, but I think looking at how the SNAP program is operated is probably a good metric. And one of the, I don't know if I want to call it positive, but one of the useful things in the bill is if you're on both programs and you meet the requirements for SNAP, you automatically satisfy for Medicaid. So we won't know all the rules of the road in Medicaid, but to the extent, however that works today in SNAP, if a person's on that, you could access it that way. And I would guess they will try to line those up as much as possible.
So, and I don't know that anyone can answer this, but what my team is asking and some of my colleagues in the community are saying, like, would we know, like, what's an estimated number of people who could potentially lose Medicaid, right? So we know a lot of us in mental health, I'm in mental health, we provide for disabled people, they're unlikely to get cut. A lot of folks, though, got in during the COVID time or around that period. Do we have a sense, like, how many?
There's been estimates put out there north of 100,000 in Minnesota, but I think until we know all of those nitty-gritty details, it's hard to say that. And as you saw, I didn't have any stats about money or people, because I think while those are useful, and I think it helps us get our arms around it, I don't know that in this phase it's as useful. What's done is done, and now we need to figure out like the how to keep that number as low as possible. So I've been reluctant to go there because I just don't think we know enough to really know how bad it's going to be. But I think it's very safe to say north of 100,000 people are at risk.
And so, like, when we're advocating, right, when we're communicating with our legislators, is there a number that we can say other than I know that this is going to potentially impact 50% of my clients that we serve?
I think that's a great number to use because I think that's more tangible. In the resources section under the Department of Human Services and DCYF, they do put some numbers to it. They update them fairly regularly as they learn more. So I would rely on their numbers as probably the closest to accurate. But I think to the extent that you can quantify it within the context of your own organization, even like what you just said, more than half, I think that's way more powerful because frankly, people are kind of dismissive of the numbers coming out of government right now.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
And as always, putting faces and stories to those numbers is the most important when advocating for legislators. I can't emphasize that enough, right? So the numbers, they tend to get sort of full of them, and as Matt said so often, people go, oh, well, that's your number, right? But when you can put a face and a story to it and then talk about, up to 50%, that's really highly helpful, impactful.
And I think, an organization like yours, you could look at your roles and say, of our population, approximately this many are in the Medicaid expansion group. Like that's the universe of people that are at least at risk and are going to be scrutinized through that lens of work reporting requirements. And so I would, if I was asked and I was in your shoes, I would say, this is the people that could lose healthcare if you don't, especially if you don't implement this correctly.
More questions or comments to share? I'd like to invite Tricia Reinwald, our VP of Member Advancement at MAC, up to here or at the podium.
I actually do have one more question, Mac. You said that, and this might be something we can work offline on, but you said that public comment on some of the rulemaking is really, really important. Is there an easy way to track when and where those public comments are going to happen on some of this? And I'm just wondering if there's like a way that even Matt could try to, I don't know, pull all that together when public comment opens on some of the stuff that members care the most about.
I think that would be a great question for our friends at Momentum. We could figure out some mechanisms. Unfortunately not. I am a sick person that reads the Federal Register every Monday. I do not recommend that. It's not good for your mental health. You can see I'm only 40 and my hair is already this gray. Don't get into that life. But we'd be happy to kind of think about how we could spread the word.
Any other questions?
Do you know, as direct service providers, how much we should be thinking about things like MNsure navigation or other systems that exist to help people meet the administrative requirements?
I think the direct service world is going to be the key to the success, or success I use in the term of people staying on healthcare or the failure of this prospect. So I think once we have those kind of rules of the road, we'll have a much better understanding of kind of what are the information sources that they're relying on. So how can you communicate with the various systems, make sure people have the right information, and even just making people aware of this. I think one thing we learned during COVID is no one saw the renewal process coming, because it was talked about in spaces that weren't the same spaces of people using the programs. And so I think at very least even an educational role to know what is happening and help people say, okay, you're going to be subject to these requirements. We can't get you through any of the exemption pieces. What can we do to make sure you're meeting your 80 hours or whatever that looks like for this month? So I think that the direct service is going to be really key to help people navigate this, because it's going to be maddeningly confusing for people to try and go through.
All right.
I have a similar kind of feeling about the, how do we navigate the additional administrative burden that's coming for us too, operationally. That's something that I've been thinking a lot about. There's more coming for the state, which obviously means more for us too. So, part of coming together today, this is hard. This is a really hard time. It's a lot to process and a lot to understand, but we're going to continue to walk together, hopefully, as a network. Try to get together more in person. And we got a long road ahead. I'm really grateful to the expertise you all have been bringing to the MAC network. So thank you to the Momentum team, and Matt, thank you. It is not easy to be the bearer of this knowledge, but I'm so grateful that you're sharing it. This is probably you're the only person I've heard speak about this that I was like, okay, I think I understand more about what's coming and what's ahead, and a little bit more about how to be prepared. So I'm grateful that we have you as a resource. thank you all for being here in person today. Couple of things to close up. Want to thank our sponsors. You see all of them here. And a special thank you to Strategic Consulting and Coaching. Cheryl Jensen's in the room. So thank you for sponsoring Max convenings. Sponsorship is really a big part of how we make convenings happen here at Max. So really grateful to you for your partnership. And so just want to say thank you to our wonderful sponsors. Just a couple things. You're going to get an e-goodie bag. You're familiar with our e-goodie bags from all of our virtual events. You're going to get one for today as well. It's going to include the recording. I know there were a few people that had to dip out a little bit early. And I think a lot of the meat at the close is super important. I know when I heard Matt first speak on this, I had to go back and watch the recording and take some more notes because it's a lot. You're going to get all the resources that were in the deck. You'll get the deck, and then there's a bunch of other resources we'll be including in the e-goodie bag. So just watch for that. And I want to leave you with kind of a to be continued and a little bit of an update. So as a part of Mac's strategic framework, we're going to be continuing to invest in advocacy. We're building capacity over time, one foot in front of the other. This is a time we all have to be leaning on each other, and this network is a unique voice in the community, and we have a real opportunity to uplift our communities, right, during a time that's really going to be tough. And for all of you as professionals in this field, we want MAC to be a place where you can lean on each other, right? And Steve mentioned that in the opening. So investing in our advocacy capacity as a network is a big part of what's ahead. We're going to be at the Capitol again this year, fighting the fraud narrative, because that's not going away, and it's going to make a lot of our work harder, continue to make it harder. So we're going to be continuing to fight that fight. Fighting bad grant management policy, because I'm sure there's going to be more of that. But we'll be up there. And we're going to be trying to work on advancing positive grant reforms. So we're going to also stay focused there. It's also really important. We're going to be looking at ways that we can use our power as a network to influence what comes next with OBBBA in Minnesota. I love your acronym also, like OBBBA for short. You were the one that gave that to us. Really helpful. Terrible name. If you haven't already, please sign up to receive updates. There is a sign-up sheet, and I will pass one around the room. You can sign up at the table at the front. There's a couple clipboards that'll make their way around the room. Want to be able to provide you some updates around policy work that MAC is doing. So if you're interested in engaging that in an ongoing way, or at least hearing updates, let us know. I don't want to spam you. Opt in if you want to keep connected. And again, thanks for being here today. Please spend some time saying hi to your colleagues. Introduce yourself to somebody you haven't met before. As he said, this is a time we need to lean on each other more and more, and MAC really wants to help be that place for all of you. We need each other to lean on each other to sort of build that resilience together, as professionals doing this work, so that we can be there for our communities. So keep showing up, and thank you for all that you do, and thanks for being here today. So thanks, everybody.